Hi everyone, thanks for listening in. My name's Euan Adie and I'm from an organisation called Overton.io, and today I'm going to talk about how the policy grey literature, the body of policy documents produced by governments worldwide, links back to the scholarly record. How does it connect? I'm going to speak a little bit about what Overton actually does and is later on, but as a kind of background, the reason we got interested in this question is because increasingly members of the public, especially, are interested in what the evidence is behind government policy decisions. So, if the government makes a decision that changes your life, what are they basing that decision on? What's the evidence? In this presentation, we're going to talk about policy documents, scholarly documents, how they all connect, like I said. The way we're going to do that is we're going to characterize their relationship using a large set of about 6.5 million documents collected from about 180 different countries, from governments in 180 different countries. We're going to look at those documents and extract the citations, so to see what do those policy documents link out to. And we'll compare the citation graph to the citation graph you get in traditional bibliometrics. Finally, at the end, we'll try and answer the question, is this data good enough to say anything about impact? Can you use it as a university or a think tank to say, look at my numbers, this is at least a signal that the work we're doing is having an impact on the real world. When Overton talks about policy documents, we talk about a wide range of different types of report and white paper and legislation and draft bills and all this kind of thing, both from government agencies and departments and third sector or even private organisations in some cases. So things like industry associations, EU agencies, IGOs like the World Health Organization. They're all part of the kind of policy making sphere, even if they're not government. And the reason for that is because if you start off with a simple definition of a policy document, just documents written by policymakers, for example, you capture things like white papers and draft bills and legislative transcripts, so that's what's being said in Congress or Parliament or whatever other kind of legislator body exists in your country, which is good, but it's only part of the story. And the reason for that is the closer you get to the legislation, the less likely it is that you'll find any evidence being cited, any kind of basic research evidence. For that, you need to go a little bit further downstream. Usually there's a translation step in between any scholarly work and the kind of final legislation. And it could be an intermediate stage within government, so a government white paper or green paper or report, a technical report from an agency, or it could be somebody completely outside of government who fulfills that purpose. So the Commonwealth Fund does it for health in the US, for example, the Institute for Fiscal Studies in the UK, lots of different think tanks and NGOs, charitable organisations, again, industry bodies. Lots of groups do the research on behalf of policymakers, and then they turn it into a message that's easier to understand and to act on, has some clear recommendations and this kind of thing. So if we're going to look at how scholarly work connects to policy work, we're going to need to bear those kind of third sector organisations in mind and bring them into the fold as well. So for this kind of project, Overton's definition changed from just documents written by policymakers to written by or specifically for policymakers, to include those documents that I just mentioned, the things like the policy briefs from think tanks, working papers from central banks, research reports from NGOs, and even to some extent things like clinical guidelines from health agencies. And once we have those, we can pull them all together into one big network that has all three kinds of document. So the final kind of legislative documents, the traditional policy documents, the scholarly work that they're basing everything off, they're basing these decisions off the evidence, and then the bits in the middle that are acting as the intermediary, as the knowledge broker. So I said I'd mention a little bit more about what Overton actually does and is. Overton's a large database of these policy documents, again, in the broad definition of the term. It collects about 6.5 million different documents, about 180 different countries, so all sorts of different places and languages, which we'll cover in a minute. And importantly, it looks at their citations and outbound links. So that could be kind of bibliography type citations, or it could be actual web links. And actually, in reality, we get it from everything from page footers and table captions and this kind of thing, as well as more structured places. So we get those citations, then we try and link them back to the scholarly record and to people and institutions and things like that. Because we've been doing this for about 2 years now, we've got that database of 6.5 million policy documents. We can already start to answer some interesting, if relatively high-level questions. As a quick aside, and this is the Grey Literature Conference, so I'm sure everyone here is very familiar with these challenges in different areas, but it's quite easy to say, okay, we'll just collect everything that's written by a policymaker or for a policymaker. Of course, turning that, putting that into practice is much more challenging. So there's very few standards or clear definitions of anything we've just talked about, of what a policy document is. Academic publishers have a very real commercial imperative to make outputs discoverable, right? Journals want more people to read their output or to subscribe to their output potentially, and certainly to cite their output. Governments don't have that incentive. They have a kind of a public mission, but it's not tied necessarily to anything that's going to force them to make changes quickly. There's no central identification or method of deduplicating policy documents across different sources or anything like that. No central search engines, so that's what we're trying to do with Overton. And centralized repositories of documents are very rare, so you can't just go to one site and expect to get all of the documents from a national government. Usually you have to go from department to department, agency to agency. You have to keep track of which departments have closed down and merged and which agencies no longer exist and all this kind of thing. That said, some countries do have these centralized repositories, so the UK, Ireland and Canada probably have the closest thing to that, and in some cases, so for federal documents, for example in the US, they're kind of on their way as well, even if it's not quite there yet. So in general, it's hard to find, collect and clean these documents, but it is possible. This hopefully is intuitive to everyone, but of course most policy documents aren't in English, just because most countries don't speak English. That said, more are in English than you might expect, and that's partly because anything with an international audience tends to be at least translated into English. It's still the lingua franca. So think tank reports, for example, in Germany or France, if they're kind of aimed at a wider audience than just the domestic one, will often appear as English as well. And of course, English is still an official government language in some places like India and Singapore and the EU that account for quite a large number of different documents. We've got, because of that centralized repository question, partly, we've got some gaps in our coverage internationally. So if you look on this map, the counts here that it's referred to in the legend, that's the counts of policy documents that we've collected from each country. So in red in the US is where we've got the most documents from. So we've got about 1.8 million different policy documents from there. That's partly because we're collecting at state level, at the federal level. There's a lot of IGOs and think tanks based in Washington, D.C. and New York. It's just a very kind of policy heavy kind of country that has a kind of long-standing tradition of making government documents available. I mentioned Canada and the UK as two countries that have done quite a lot to centralise their documents. So again, they're quite well represented. But there's quite a lot of countries, especially if you look at Africa, sub-Saharan Africa especially, where there's like a band of grey there across the continent, where we have very few documents. And that's because we're online. We're an online database. We're not dealing with paper. And some of these countries just don't have any policy available online in any kind of way that we could collect. Sometimes it's because it's not being put online, so the government isn't digital yet. And sometimes it's because there is literally no policy. So if you think about South Sudan, for example, there's very little kind of written, no bureaucracy happening there, and certainly no kind of written policies being put up on a website somewhere. Because policy documents come from lots of different countries, lots of different types, the citation norms and styles vary wildly. So this is a big difference between the scholarly world and the policy world. In the scholarly world, if you submit a paper to a journal, I'm sure everyone's been through this, and God forbid you fail to format the references correctly, it might be sent back to you. Okay, there's a reason for you to cite it in MLA or Chicago style or Harvard style or whatever. But policymakers have no such need to conform to citations norms. They tend to cite whatever style feels best on the day without being unkind, and fair enough, maybe that's the better system. So sometimes the style changes from chapter to chapter, sometimes from page to page. Here's an example policy document. This one actually isn't too bad. So this is a report from the House Natural Resources Committee. So that's a committee in US Congress. They've produced this report on a hearing about the role of public relations firms in preventing action on climate change. And here there's no bibliography section or anything like that, but they have evidenced things that they're saying with footnotes. And when we look at the footnotes, they are somewhere in between traditional references and something much more informal. So we can see on the left, the first reference there has a DOI link in it, for example, and it's fairly clearly formatted as a journal reference, and there's a book on number 3 as well. And then that's actually, it happens in policy documents, but it's a bit more rare than what you would see on the right-hand side, which is it's more common, where the things being referenced are themselves grey literature. They are themselves policy documents, and this happens a lot, where it's sometimes hard to parse out exactly what these things are without kind of knowledge of the context of the document. If we look at policy documents from different sources and we kind of break it up into how many of them are citing scholarly work, so things like that journal article and book, and how many are citing other policy sources, so other reports from the policy world, other bits of legislation, that kind of thing. The numbers vary widely across sources. So GovUK, I mentioned being the centralised repository again in the UK for lots of different departmental outputs. And of them, about 8% of them cite at least one scholarly paper. So 8% of all of the documents on GovUK, and about 5% cite other policy sources. And that's because it is a very generalised repository of everything the government's producing. If you look at something a bit more focused, like the Congressional Research Service, so the Congressional Research Service, their job is to go out and do kind of reviews of the literature or the current kind of policy landscape, and then to synthesize that into a short document that's then distributed to Congress people to read and to inform them. 23% of their outputs cite a scholarly paper, so they're relying much more heavily on the scholarly world for evidence, and 33% of their documents cite other policy sources. So often that's going to be think tanks, lobbyist reports, NGOs, charitable foundations, all that kind of thing. In general, in terms of how much of the scholarly literature is cited, it's a bit like traditional bibliometrics, and there's a bit of a long tail. So a lot of papers, or there's a set of papers rather, that get cited very frequently, and there's a long tail of papers that get cited kind of once or twice. In general, a few groups have looked at this. So one in CWTS in Leiden, and another one Science Metrics in Canada, which is now owned by Elsevier, or Science Metrics is owned by Elsevier, I should say. They've both looked at this, and they've found similar kind of numbers, which is around between kind of 5 and 8% of articles end up being cited in policy at least once. So the bullet point I've got here on this slide is from the Science Metrics study, and they took all of the Scopus articles, all the articles in Scopus, the abstract and indexing database, published between 2008 and 2016. So they've had long enough time to be cited in policy. And then they checked them in Overton to see, do they have at least one policy citation? It came back with about 5.8% of them do have at least one citation in policy. Interestingly, it varied a lot based on subject. So to test this, they took random samples of articles in different subject areas. And of the development studies sample, for example, they found 47% were cited at least once in policy, but of the drama and theatre sample, only 0.1% were cited in policy. So it kind of makes sense intuitively, but the data bears it out. Interestingly, when you look at all of those subjects together, you see something markedly different to what you would expect if you were coming from the scholarly bibliometrics world. So in scholarly bibliometrics, it's the hard sciences that get cited the most, and the social sciences are very much the poor cousin. So, high energy physics and cancer get a lot of citations, and social sciences don't. In the policy world, it's the opposite. Well, not quite the opposite, but it's different. It's flipped. The social sciences and humanities is the kind of broad subject area that gets cited the most in policy. And actually, the harder the science you are, if you're, organic chemistry or quantum physics or something, the less likely it is that you're going to be cited at all. Which makes sense. Policymakers just aren't citing quantum physics papers. What they are citing, if you look on the right-hand side, the right-hand graph, we've broken up social sciences into the different kind of subdisciplines, is economics and psychology. That said, some parts of the life science especially are still cited a lot. If you think about public health, for example, or during the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously lots of lawmakers and policymakers were basically citing medRxiv and other medical journals. So it does absolutely still happen, but it's the social sciences that tend to come out on top. Policy documents also tend to cite locally. So this isn't necessarily a surprise when you think about when a policymaker goes looking for evidence, they're going to look for local expertise who can come in and be embedded with the department, or can come and give evidence to a committee, or they'll put out a call for evidence. And the people kind of most rewarded for responding to those calls for evidence are the people in the country it came from. But if you look at all the policy documents from Australia, and then all of the scholarly research that they cite as evidence, and then you look at the affiliations of those scholarly articles, the top three affiliations, the affiliations that crop up the most often, are all Australian. So, who's providing most of the evidence, or evidence most frequently, rather, to Australian policy documents? It's Melbourne, Sydney, and the ANU. Equally in the US, it's 3 US universities, Harvard, Stanford, and Washington. In Sweden, it's 3 Swedish universities. In Brazil, it's 3 Brazilian universities. And that holds pretty true for most countries. The exceptions are smaller countries, where I think they maybe don't necessarily have the research base to be able to answer all the questions required by policymakers. So Singapore, for example, they're the top 3 universities in terms of the numbers of papers being cited by government there aren't Singaporean, they're from elsewhere in the world. When you look at policy-to-policy citations, so this is a government policy document that cites one of those knowledge brokers, a think tank, for example, or a think tank citing another think tank. You get another surprise compared to what you might expect if you're coming from the scholarly world, which is that there are a lot of citation networks, or actually what would potentially be classed as a citation cartel in the scholarly world. And this would get you a kind of slap on the wrist and get your journal delisted from Web of Science, for example. But between think tanks, there's no such problem. So it's not considered a bad thing to have a citation cartel in think tank land. It's considered good marketing, right? So what you're doing is you're amplifying the voices of the people who agree with you and who are promoting a similar message to you. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a different way of approaching it. But it does mean that when you're doing any citation analysis, you have to be aware of this kind of thing. Like it very much exists, and it's encouraged rather than punished. In terms of how fast is policy at picking up research, we were interested in this question because, again, I mentioned COVID-19 earlier. We were seeing articles being published in medRxiv on the preprint server, and then appearing in policy 2 weeks later. So the turnaround time was really, really short. A lot of policy then was being written by experts kind of drafted in or being repurposed from bodies like the WHO. It partly accounts for that. More generally, though, when we look at all the articles, for example, published in 2010, and then we graph, what was the year where they were first cited, the kind of half-life of that graph is about just under 4 years after publication. So what we're saying is, in general, on average, so obviously it varies a lot based on discipline especially, but on average it takes about 4 years for a piece of scholarly work to start appearing in policy. At the beginning, I mentioned that we were going to tie all this back to impact and ask the question of, given that we can extract these citations between policy documents and between policy and scholarly documents, is it something we can use to measure impact? So practically speaking, what we're really asking is, as a university, can we look at this policy data and say, we're doing better or worse than expected, or compared to our peers in influencing policy, either locally or internationally? Or as a think tank, for example, can we say that we're doing a good job of influencing government policy because our work is being cited more often than our peers, or than you might expect at random? And I mean, the spoilers, tentatively, the answer is yes. I think there is enough of a link there, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. But one important thing to remember is that a citation itself is not impact. It's just a pointer. It's an indicator that impact did happen. And the reason for that is because after a policy is put into legislation, is made law, if it does get to that point, that doesn't necessarily mean it changes people's lives. So if step one is being cited, there is a step two where then gets put into practice and it changes things, and that's the best outcome. Hopefully it changes lives for the better and not for the worse. That's a different kind of impact. But there are other possibilities as well. There's a step two in policy, which isn't infrequent, it's not uncommon, where the policy is implemented but it's then kind of quietly forgotten about. It doesn't really make any difference to anyone. It's technically true, but in practice not makes no difference. Or another step two, where it's implemented and then an incoming administration 2 years later comes in, or even earlier, comes in and immediately scraps it. So perhaps even before it had time to be picked up and properly acted on. So can we say for sure that impact happened if you're cited by policy? No, you can't, because we don't have all of the available data. But what it does do is highlight that pathway happened, that there's a possibility of it. So all that said, and that was quite a like a drastic caveat, but all that said, we do see correlations between real world impact and policy citations. One example of that was a study we published recently, or at least we published the beginning of it in QSS, the journal, and we looked at data from REF in the UK, which I won't go into a lot of detail about the REF here, but basically it's a mechanism by which every 4 or 5 years the UK government assesses the work of every university in the UK, and it determines how much block funding they get from the government. And the way it works is universities write case studies for the impact of their best work, and all those case studies are peer reviewed centrally and scored, and then the score there's a kind of complicated weighting system, but the higher the score, the more funding you get from the government as a university. So it costs a lot of money to run. A lot of people spend a lot of time writing case studies. It's a very big deal for universities. And they release the data afterwards, somewhat redacted, so it makes it hard to do analysis in detail on it. But what we can see is that there's a correlation between the number of highly cited in policy articles that a university has. So the more articles that a university has produced that are cited a lot in policy, and the number of highly scoring case studies to do with policy impact that it has. So that's the human written case studies about, we did this work and it influenced policy, and then another human has read it and said, yes, that does sound like a real impact to me, 5 out of 5 or or less, as the case may be. So that correlation does exist, so that implies that there is something there. Okay, thanks very much for listening. I'm going to wrap up quickly now, just in summary. So first of all, when you're looking at government documents, when you're doing any study of government documents, especially linking it back to other groups like Scholarly World, you probably also want to consider these policy adjacent third sector organisations and include them too. They're an important part of the ecosystem. Policy documents, not surprising again to anyone here in the conference, but they come in a range of different styles and sizes. It's very difficult to clean and collect and normalise them. They lack many of the standards we take for granted in the scholarly world, certainly, but they are connected in a very significant way to scholars and scholarship. They cite a lot of research, and they cite it frequently, both research from universities and other kind of grey literature research, if you like. So they cite a lot of research from IGOs and think tanks and private organisations. In those citations, we see more social sciences links and kind of more hard science research. And there does seem to be that link between policy citations and policy impact assessed by human beings. Thanks very much. I'm happy to take questions later, or you can find my Twitter handle and email in the speaker bios. Thank you.